For part 3 of the risk assessment project, what you need to do is to select 3 actions that you're going to go on to justify why you've chosen those 3 particular actions. The actions that you're selecting are from column 4, so this column here. You're not selecting 3 hazards from column 1, so what you need to do is basically have a look through and select your 3 highest priority actions. This is going to be based on what the highest level of risk is. You can select more than one action within a hazard, if that makes sense. So let's go over to the example that NEBOSH provide. The ones that they have selected in their example is they've selected 2 from the first hazard that they talk about, and then further on down, the 3rd action is to do with working at height. Overall, there are about 50 different actions in column 4. There's quite a few of those actions that they could have chosen as alternatives. I don't think you need to be over agonizing about which actions to select, as long as you are taking them from significant hazards and that you are able to justify your selection later on in part 3. So it might be because the hazard is high in terms of the severity of harm that could be caused, but it could be something more along the lines of the hazard involves many people. Like, for example, you might be working in a sales call centre and literally every single person is classed as a display screen user. And so every person is affected by potential musculoskeletal disorders through poor workstation design. Everybody works sort of 8-hour shifts, so it's the frequency and duration that is significant. So you could choose an action to address that, even though nobody is at risk of fatalities. It still could be justified as being a significant hazard, and therefore your actions to control it, you'll find it easy to justify based on frequency of exposure to harm and the duration of exposure. And then what you need to do is, once you've got your 3 actions selected from column 4, is if I go down to part 3, we'll come back to this bit, moral and financial arguments for all actions, but what you can do is scroll down a little bit further and just put your actions in. So you can take this directly from the risk assessment. So whatever you've got in the risk assessment, grab it, put it in the action. And what they've done here is on the example, they've also in brackets put what the hazard category is. Do the same for the next one. Enclosed area to be set up for sanding, grinding operations, including suitable local exhaust ventilation. Hazard category, hazardous substances. And there were 2 actions that were chosen from this one, the other one being purchase of on-tool dust extraction systems. So just put them in there for now on the table, then go back up to this first bit, because this first bit of part 3, what you need to do is, in this part, make moral and financial arguments. And what you can also do, and I would advise you do this, is put in some general legal arguments as well, not specific legal arguments. I'll come on to that in a second. So this first bit is the moral argument. So NGG Limited has a moral duty to protect all workers. Our workers come to work to earn a wage, not to be put at risk of falling ill now or in the future. So moral argument. And the paragraph goes on along that same vein in terms of the moral arguments. Then they talk about financial impact, so making persuasive financial arguments. And then this 3rd paragraph is the general legal argument, so enforcement action, issue of enforcement notices, the fact that the HSE may decide to prosecute, civil claims as well. Then for each action, so this is where it splits out and you're taking each action on its own as a separate thing. Specific legal arguments. So this is for action 1. And what you've got to do here is be very specific in terms of This one is obviously about work at height. And what they've put in the example is the specific duties that NGG need to meet under Work at Height Regulations 2005. There's a duty to ensure that work at height is, and Regulation 4A says that work at height has got to be properly planned, and then Regulation 4C, work at height has got to be carried out in a manner which, insofar as is reasonably practicable, safe. Now, it's important on this bit that you don't just chuck references to specific legislation without some sort of justification as to why you're putting that in there. So in the example, that is provided in the next sentence. Instructions are given to the workforce to walk around the inspection pit if they are working in the area. But these instructions are usually ignored. Workers will jump across the pit rather than work around it. Relying on instructions alone for something that could cause severe injury, i.e. falling into the inspection pit accidentally, would not satisfy the legal requirements for working safely. NGG Limited are therefore failing in this duty. So importantly, the reference to the specific piece of legislation is there, and it's technically accurate, but also the reason why the person that put this together thinks that that piece of legislation is being breached based on the workplace circumstances is also there. So they've talked a little bit about the unsafe acts and unsafe behaviours that are taking place in that work environment that makes the link between what's actually going on and what the specific legal duties are that are being breached because of what's going on. So in the third row down, this is where you put in your consideration of the likelihood and severity. So this is kind of like the risk evaluation part of it. So the likelihood of injuries occurring from working in and around the inspection pit is very likely. This is due to the inspection pit being in daily use, and most mechanics will work in this area at least 2 or 3 times a week for an average of 2 hours per job. So just to point out something here, they've obviously stated in the example that they regard the likelihood of harm being very likely, but not only that, they've also explained why they think that it's very likely. And then the severity, they've split it up into 4 different categories. This is something that you might be familiar with if you've done risk assessments before. Minimal level of harm, minor level of harm, major level of harm, and catastrophic level of harm. And they've put that severity as being major. So again, they've stated what the severity level is in their judgment, and they've also explained why they think that that severity level is being judged as major. So these are the important points that I want you to make sure that you stick to. Is don't just say that you think it's, highly likely and a very severe injury. Just go on to put a couple of sentences to explain why you think that. The next part, how effective is the action likely to be in controlling the risk? Explanation to be given needs to include the intended impact of the action. That one's pretty self-explanatory, I think. I don't think I've got much to add to that one. Just basically explain, what you think your action is going to be actually doing. But then the next part is the time scale, justification for the time scale that you indicated in your risk assessment. If you've approached it correctly in the first place when you did the timescale originally, which was the risk assessment table, you shouldn't have any issue in justifying the timescale. So if you're putting a very long timescale on it, that would be fine if the action that you've put in place, that you've selected, is to address more sort of underlying and root causes. So if you are having problems with the timescale part of this, it might be an idea to go back and review that timescale to see whether it is actually appropriate. The next bit that you've got to include is whether you think the action will fully control the risk. And what you might be thinking here is, well, of course I think the action will fully control the risk, because otherwise I wouldn't put it in. But actually, it's quite reasonable for one action to not fully control the risk. It's quite common for risk control measures to be used in conjunction with each other and complement each other. So in the example that NEBOSH provide, the first one, they reckon it will fully control the risk as long as the bridge is used, maintained and inspected as set out in the safe system of work that will be produced following the purchase. But then their next couple of actions on their own won't fully control the risk, and they make that clear. They've put for the second action, the enclosed area to be set up, they've put once installed, the dust enclosure alone will not fully control the risk, but will significantly reduce it if it is used in conjunction with the other suggested control measure, e.g. the on-tool extraction. It should fully control the risk. And then obviously the next action is the on-tool extraction. So again, this action alone won't fully control the hazard. It needs to be used in conjunction with the other controls that have been identified in the risk assessment. So I think the takeaway from that part is, don't worry too much if your action that you've selected is not going to actually fully control the risk. It's perfectly reasonable to expect that it won't on its own fully control the risk. So I think that's it really for part 3. So just remember, the first part of it is you're making moral and financial and general legal arguments based on all 3 actions in the round, and then you're going on to deal with each action separately, where you're putting in specific legal arguments and reasons why, so specific breaches and reasons why you think the circumstances give rise to a breach, consideration of likelihood and severity, and how effective the action is likely to be in controlling the risk, based on each action separately. So I hope that makes it clear. I hope that you found that helpful. I hope you've got some value out of the video that you've just seen. If so, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel so that you can be alerted to when we produce and upload more videos.